Okay, the next learning outcome, to understand the importance of safe working practices to comply with legal requirements. This learning outcome is broken down into the following assessment criteria. So by the end of this session, learners will be able to identify their responsibilities under the Health and Safety at Work Act, to identify the risks of lone working within the private security industry, to identify typical workplace hazards and risks and the definition of those, state how to minimise risks to personal safety at work, to be able to identify the safety and signals signage regulations, to state the reporting procedures for health and safety accidents and incidents, and to identify ways of keeping personal information safe. So every year, thousands of people take time off work due to injuries that could have been avoided if health and safety procedures were better. For some people, this may only mean a few days off work, but for others, it could mean long-term injuries or even death. The vast majority of incidents can be avoided through better health and safety procedures. So health and safety procedures in a workplace need to be effective to keep staff, visitors and customers safe. There's specific legislation in place to ensure that proper health and safety procedures are enforced anywhere where people come in to either be served or come to work. And of course they're there to keep everybody safe. So we got the main bit of legislation we're looking at today is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. So this covers responsibilities of people who control premises, so employers, also employees, self-employed, subcontractors, suppliers, as well as visitors or customers coming to the site. Those failing to comply with health and safety legislation face a range of penalties, and a business can even be closed for serious breaches. So breaches of legislation can be either dealt with by the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, or the local environmental health practitioner, known as the EHP, from the local authority. So breaches can result in either improvement notices, prohibition notices, and or criminal proceedings. So duty of care. Employers have a moral and legal duty of care to protect the health, safety and well-being of their employees and others, including customers and members of the public who might be affected by their business. So employers must do whatever is reasonably practicable to achieve this. So serious breaches of health and safety legislation can result in penalties of up to 2 years in prison and or unlimited fines. So under Section 2, duty of employers is to ensure the health, the safety and the welfare of their staff as far as reasonably practicable by undertaking risk assessments and implementing processes and procedures. That's Section 2. Section 3 states the duty of all employers and self-employed persons to ensure that as far as reasonably practical and necessary, the safety of persons other than employees, so for example contractors, visitors and the general public and clients coming to the premises are also to their premises are also safe. So the employer must provide a duty of care to all staff. This includes carrying out risk assessments to identify the potential possible hazards and risks, do what they can to remove or reduce those risks, to provide relevant instruction and or training to ensure those risks are reduced, and to ensure safe working procedures, including for what would also be for lone workers. Their obligation is also to record those injuries or injuries and accidents, to provide, where necessary, PPE or personal protective equipment, and to provide a shortened version of the health and safety policy to staff on notice boards. So employers also must have proper first aid facilities and to ensure that there are proper reporting procedures in place in case there are incidents. So depending on the size of the site and the number of people working there, we also have to provide a written health and safety policy or even form a safety committee. Okay, so let's rewind for a second and come back to PPE, personal protective equipment. So part of your employer's responsibilities include the provision of personal protective equipment, and just look, as a security operative, what could that include? So things like waterproof clothing and high visibility clothing, maybe body worn cameras, headwear such as hard hats, especially if you're working on building sites, gloves, which could be including things like search gloves or even needle or slash resistant, face shields, a little bit more apparent nowadays, maybe stab resistant vests, metal detectors for searching, things like radios, ear defenders. Okay, so the list goes on. Okay, but that may be provided by your employer, and of course the whole purpose is to reduce the risk. Let's look at Section 7 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. So that's duty of employees. So and that is to take reasonable care for the health and the safety of him or herself or other persons who may be affected by his or her acts or omissions at work, and to cooperate fully with the employer and other persons so far as it is necessary, enable them to perform their duties or requirements under the Act. Okay, so that's Section 7 under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, which is the duty of employees, which pretty much in short means that once your employer has conducted that risk assessment and provided you with training or personal protective equipment, it's your responsibility to follow those instructions and wear that PPE. If you don't, then of course you haven't been involved in an incident at work that wasn't your fault, because it was your fault because you wouldn't follow instructions. I hope that makes sense. I'm sure it does. So employees and self-employed people working on a site, whether they're full-time or part-time, you must, by law, take reasonable care of your own health and safety. You should not do anything unsafe. You should understand the risk assessment process, follow the organisation's health and safety policy, obey all safety instructions, report injuries and accidents to the employer, use any personal protective equipment provided, and follow the organisation's emergency procedures and any procedures for lone work. Okay, let's look at the next assessment criteria, which is identify the risks of lone working within the private security industry. So lone working is an individual doing or performing a shift on their own. So if you are going to be working alone in security, it could put you at particular risk. You're quite susceptible to things like violence or injury, because if you come across an encounter or a situation and it's too late to withdraw, you then may find yourself in a situation where you're confronted on your own to deal with whatever that situation is. Yes, you may well have a radio or like an emergency button, but how long is that going to take by the time you push it and that person or your team back up, get there? Other things that can happen over time is kind of ill health, really, a lack of people to talk to, and also a lack of welfare facilities for resting. And so think about the role of lone working, and make sure you read your AIs and follow any instructions in relation to reducing those risks. We look at the next assessment criteria now, which is identifying typical workplace hazards and risks. So you need to understand what they are, the definitions, and give some examples of what they are. So let's revisit for a second Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, Section 2 and Section 3, which is the employer's obligation to ensure, as far as it's reasonably practicable, the safety of their staff, visitors, etc., by undertaking risk assessments and implementing processes and procedures. Okay, so what is a risk assessment? So the actual definition of risk assessment is the identification of hazards, the calculation of risks, the reduction of that risk either completely or to an acceptable level. Okay, so let's look at the stages of doing that. The very first stage of a risk assessment is the identification of hazards. So what is the definition of a hazard? A hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm. Now, quite often, a question I ask to groups, and I say, give me an example of the most common hazard in the workplace. And most people think, you may have thought this now, slip, trips and falls. I say, well, that's wrong. They go, well, what do you mean that's wrong? I say, well, is that a hazard or is that the result of a hazard? You see, a hazard is something that's got the potential to cause harm, not the actual harm happening. So a potential hazard which could result in slips, trips and falls could be a wet floor or slippery surface. That's a hazard. The result or the risk would then be or slips, trips and falls. Okay, so a hazard, anything that has the potential to cause harm. The next stage is calculating the risk. What is a risk? Well, the risk is the likelihood of that harm occurring in certain circumstances and to whom. The next stage is to evaluate the risk by considering existing precautions that are in place already, and then to record those findings and then to finally review and revise where necessary. So let's have some examples, or let's look at some examples of typical workplace hazards. Okay, so misuse or abuse of machinery could be one. Now, think, well, is that the result? Is that the risk or the hazard? Well, it's a hazard, isn't it? Because if someone has been provided with training on how to use a machine or provided personal protective equipment and they don't use it, they may not cause themselves an injury, but they've got the potential to do so. So that's a hazard. Other hazards are sharp objects like needles and knives, particularly when searching. Faulty electrics, loose carpets, noise pollution, wet floors from weather or spillages. Of course, violence caused by others, and another good, important reason why we can communicate effectively with service users in order to reduce the risk of violence. Other hazards are moving vehicles, locked or blocked fire exits, obstructions, poor lighting, overcrowding, fire, floods and other potential emergencies, and of course the elements, which the weather. So let's have a look at another assessment criteria now. State how to minimise a risk to personal safety at work. So think about your own personal safety and part of your role and what you would do. Of course, there's various different different times where you may come into contact with conflict, but other like manual things that you'll be doing. One of the things could be manual handling. So as part of your role, from time to time, you may need to lift or move something. This could or likely include people, and whilst you'll need specific training regarding the movement of people, it's helpful to have a basic understanding of the basics of manual handling. So definition of manual handling is the movement or support of any load by physical effort, including lifting, moving, carrying, pushing or pulling. So if you lift or move heavy objects without using recognised procedures, you run the risk of sustaining any serious injuries. So that could include things like fractures, spinal disc injuries, trapped nerves, damage to muscles, damaged ligaments, tendons, abrasions, cuts, hernias, etc. So not great. So as a guide, before attempting to lift a load, I've got a basic acronym for you here. It's called LIGHT, which is quite relevant considering it's manual handling. So if you look at LIGHT, look at L, so that's going to be the load. Okay, so before you lift it, look at it. Is it too heavy? Can it be lightened? Can it be split? If it's unstable, is it unstable? Could handles be fitted or the load be reproportioned, taking bits at a time? I, individual. So consider the capability of the person, i.e. you. Are you strong enough and fit enough to be able to lift it? And are you trained for the task? T, task. Evaluate the job to be done. Does the task involve stretching, twisting or bending? Can machinery be used or can we get someone else to give us a hand? And environment, E. So control the environment where the task takes place. Is the floor slippery? Is it uneven? Could the layout of the floor be changed or improved? Okay, so all types of things that we need to consider in the form of a risk assessment before moving something. And when it comes to actually moving it and think, yeah, we can do it, there's 6 safe lifting techniques, okay, or basic principles. So first thing is stop and think of light as we've been through. Then position your feet correctly. So feet slightly apart, knees slightly bent. Get a firm grip, keep the back slightly flexed and raise up with the legs, okay, and keep the load close to the body. So when you're lifting it, so you'll lift through your knees, so you'll bend your knees and keep your back slightly flexed. Let's look at the next assessment criteria now, which is the identification of safety signs and signals. So all workplaces in which public enter or work must have safety signs in place in line with Health and Safety Regulations 1996, Safety Signs and Signals Regulations 1996. Okay, so these signs are colour-coded and have specific shapes according to their meaning. Okay, so safety signs are used generally to communicate health and safety instructions. They must be kept clean, good condition, they must be displayed where they can be easily seen. So security operatives must be aware of the colours and shapes of the 6 different types of signs. And there's no doubt that you will be asked questions in the exam in relation to this. So the first thing we're going to look at, or first one we're going to look at, is a red circle with the bar through it. What is it? Well, it's a prohibition. Stop, do not enter. So these signs are used to tell people they must not do something. So for example, no smoking, no mobile phones, no dogs, no exit, etc. All about a yellow sign with black writing. What does that tell you? Okay, so that's a caution or a warning or a hazard sign. So the sign's used to warn people, and so examples could be like slippery floor. You see on the buildings, on like the electricity doors, high voltage electricity, danger of death, CCTV in operation, etc., etc. So yellow sign with black writing is warning. What's the colour sign which tells you must do something? Do you remember that one? It's the mandatory or obey. What is that one? It's just a blue sign, white writing. Okay, these signs are used to tell people that they must do something. So examples of those is when you look on fire doors, say fire door, keep shut or keep locked. Keep out signs, must wear a hard hat, must wear this, must wear that, do this. Mandatory means obey. Okay, we then have a safe condition sign, which is generally green with white writing. So these signs inform people of safe conditions, so things like first aid, fire exits, assembly points, etc. So that's a green sign with white writing. Okay, we then have fire equipment. So how do we identify fire equipment signs? Well, usually either red squares or red rectangles. Okay, and they inform people of fire equipment and contain information regarding that equipment. So if you look next to fire extinguishers or fire panels, etc., you'll either see red squares or rectangles, and you can go up and have a read them, and it will tell you what the equipment is for. And the last one we're going to look at is the hazardous substance signs. So what do they look like? What shape are they? Okay, so they're usually a diamond type shape, and they've got multi-colors depending on the contents. And so the signs are generally to warn people about dangerous chemicals. So it could include like flammable liquids, toxic gases, compressed gases, corrosive materials, etc., etc. Let's look at the next assessment criteria now, which is state reporting procedures for health and safety accidents and incidents. So following any accident or medical incident, it's important to record all details relating to the situation. Okay, the information contained in the accident or incident can of course help employers to identify accident trends so they can improve practices, and of course to reduce potentially similar occurrences. The records could also be used for insurance purposes, investigatory purposes, or also in the court of law. So it's very important that they are written appropriately and properly. So let's look at some of the rules. So the things that must be included either in an incident report or an accident report. So the day, the date, and the time of the incident, the location of the incident, how you were alerted to it, what you saw, what you were told, what happened, what action you took, whether first aid was required, whether the emergency services were called, what the result was, details of any injuries, details of any witnesses, and any descriptions of property or people. There's quite a bit to go into that report. And then at a more serious level, we have the RIDDOR. Okay, and the RIDDOR stands for Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrence Regulations. Okay, now the RIDDOR regulations are for serious accidents or incidents or near misses that happen at work. So the employer or the designated responsible person is required by law to notify the health and safety executive about that incident. And this either can be done either by phone, online, or by post, but it's important that that is done. So as a security operative, you're obliged to report, but not necessarily under the RIDDOR, but any incidents to your employer. Okay, and if that incident is serious enough, of course, they would then, the employer or the person in charge or a self-employed person would then report to the HSE the incident under the RIDDOR in order that it can be investigated. The last of the assessment criteria for this unit, which is identify ways of keeping personal information safe. And so we've already kind of touched on that before with the data protection, so we're just going to touch it on again because we're still about report writing at the moment. So it's important that personal information is kept safe, especially when handling any other person's information. Okay? Security officers must comply with the current data protection legislation. You must follow organizational procedures, follow your assignment instructions, and of course maintain confidentiality of the information. So under the GDPR 2018, this covers information related to a person or data subject that can be used directly or indirectly against them. Okay, so your employer must have policy in place in relation to report writing and confidentiality. So what you need to consider as well, what could also come under their personal information would be things like anything from their name, a photo of them, an email address, to things like bank details, social media posts, biometric data, and medical information. So how can we keep that safe? Or how can we keep personal information safe? Using personal social media responsibly, including managing your privacy settings, but also includes incidents at work. Okay, so don't start taking videos of situations that happen at work and then putting them onto your social media. Bad. Don't wear anything identical outside your workplace. So identity cards. Quite often people will wear uniform and they'll wear their ID cards outside the workplace, which potentially could be giving people information about where you work and timings, etc. So you should change your clothes and change out of any ID wear. Keep your personal vigilance about you, okay, as well. I mean, If you're asked to complete surveys in relation to work, what information you divulge and to ensure that, that you do that appropriately. Don't discuss work issues outside of the workplace. That's another issue as well, isn't it? That achieves this learning outcome, and so the learning outcome was to understand the importance of health and safety practices to comply with legal requirements. Let's have a quick squiz through those assessment criteria just to see that we've covered those points. So identify the responsibilities under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So we've got the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, puts an obligation on employers to conduct risk assessments, provide personal protective equipment for their employers, and of course look after people as they come into the premises. The employee has an obligation under the Health and Safety at Work Act to follow those procedures and to wear any personal protective equipment, etc. Part of the employer's duty of care is to conduct that risk assessment. And so to conduct a risk assessment, they must first identify hazards. What is the definition of a hazard? Hazards got anything that has the potential to cause harm. And then you need to understand about risk. The risk is a chance of that harm happening in certain circumstances and to whom. So there's the two definitions there. Okay, so the next criteria is to identify risks of lone working within the private security industry. So as we discussed with lone working, you're on your own. No welfare facilities, no immediate backup, just relying on communication, and it can be quite lonely doing that for a period of time. So there must consider that and have responses in place. The next one, assessment criteria, is identify typical workplace hazards and risks. So typical hazards would be things like wet flooring, loose carpets, electrics, sharps, etc., etc. The risks could be slips, trips and falls, stabs with needles, contraction of diseases, tripping over, etc. Next criteria is show how to minimize risk to personal safety at work. We discussed the manual handling, didn't we, in relation to moving stuff. Is to think before you do it, and then follow those basic 6 principles of when you're doing manual handling. The next criteria was identifying the safety signs and signals, and so that was looking at the different shapes there, wasn't it? Different shapes and colours of the signs. State reporting procedures for health and safety accidents and incidents was in relation to completing report books, and also the RIDDOR, etc., and the obligation to complete that or to report that to employers so they can complete the report to the HSE. And last assessment criteria was to identify ways of keeping personal information safe. And that's, in short, is don't share extra information, don't share stuff on your social media, don't wear ID work clothes outside of work if possible, and of course don't share sensitive information that happens in work to outside.